Tonight I'm going to be talking on John Ruskin and modern painters. In fact, on the 8th of October, I shall also be talking on a painter prior to the Victorian period. In fact, he died just a few months before Victoria acceded to the throne, and in 1837 I'm going to be talking about John Constable. But I've altered my little talk that I had done before on Constable, linking him in with how he influenced other, what his influence was during the Victorian period. So enough of that. I'm tackling tonight, I realise, an enormous subject, and please forgive me if you are already an expert in Ruskin. It's rather like when I tackle a talk on William Blake. There's always much more to say and much more to reveal. And so therefore, what I plan to do tonight is to link in Ruskin's aesthetic theories, basically, with a broad view of his life. And I'm sure over the next year or maybe of talks that we'll be able to expand upon various areas that I touch on tonight. We've already met some of the painters I'm going to talk about tonight, and so Ruskin isn't exactly a stranger to this group who have been to the other talks, whether you've been talking about politics or life in Victorian England, Victorian literature, and certainly in Victorian painting, because Ruskin indeed spans all of these main areas. And tonight I'm going to try and give you this overview of his life in the context of his great work, entry into the field of aesthetics, his 5 volumes of Modern Painters, begun in 1843. Now, John Ruskin, a little overview of the background to his life. John Ruskin was born on the 8th of February in 1819. He was the only son of Margaret and John James Ruskin. His mother was a devout evangelical Christian, and this formed Ruskin's life. And indeed, one can say it is the Bible and Christian worldview that certainly forms Ruskin's, underpins his philosophy and all that he was to approach in his work throughout his life. But we notice that this is modified and changes throughout his life as we follow it through. He was born to John James Ruskin, who, in fact, they were a wealthy middle-class family. John James Ruskin worked for Domecq, which is the famous sherry company, which necessitated quite a lot of travel, and they were very well-travelled people, visiting Europe on business most years, and from the age of 14, Ruskin, the young John Ruskin, would accompany them, and that was when he got his first sight of the Alps and of Venice and the places which would play such an important part in his understanding of what art could do and the purpose of art, and how it could ennoble people and could involve people in a much deeper interaction with the world. It is said that Ruskin had few toys as a child. That's a little painting, just taken a little cutout of John Ruskin, aged 3, by James Northcote, a famous artist of the 1820s. And Ruskin had few toys. Any toys or playthings he did have had a moral purpose. So things like the Holy Alphabet. He might have jigsaw puzzles. He might have a Noah's Ark. But it was a restricted sort of thing, and he actually speaks in his unfinished autobiography about actually focusing on the wallpaper of his house, and you can remember that as one of his early memories. The family moved to Herne Hill and then to Denmark Hill. The family operated really as a unit, and this is something very significant and has a great bearing on Ruskin's personal life, I believe. Ruskin was as I say, came from an evangelical background, and the idea of original sin was inculcated into him, and the man's fall and fallen state, it plays a very, very important part in his understanding of the world and man's place within the world. So I've just included the famous Masaccio expulsion from Eden, which Ruskin actually talks about. Ruskin was very, very enthusiastic about some of the early Italian painters, and he is one of the first commentators on the art of the 14th and 15th century Florence, and it brings that really into focus. So that too informs a lot of what he goes on to describe in Modern Painters and other works such as the Stones of Venice. The family were great collectors of paintings, and so throughout John Ruskin's boyhood, his father, John James Ruskin, was equally passionate about collecting art. This is where Ruskin got his first introduction, initially through the paintings of Turner. Later, he was to meet Turner. His father purchased mainly watercolors by Turner, of which that one in the lower left-hand corner is a good example. They were very keen on the watercolors of Samuel Prout, who painted these wonderful topographic views of places on the Grand Tour of Europe, and places that he would have passed through on his passage through to Italy, particularly through Germany, through France. So they're very well studied and architectural studied works of Samuel Prout, a well-known watercolorist of the time. They collected Girtin's watercolors. Also William Henry Hunt, who was painted in a highly detailed studies from nature, which again inspired Ruskin throughout his life and through his own work as well. You can see indications of Henry Hunt's work in Ruskin's own watercolors and drawings. I should say from a very early age, Ruskin expressed a great interest in drawing and painting, and so he was encouraged in that from the very earliest age, as well as memorizing entire books of the Bible by heart. And this accounts for some of his prose being so rich and linguistically rich. Ruskin also wrote poetry from an early age as well. So he was a highly erudite man, although he was homeschooled, but that didn't mean to say he had various tutors because his parents were wealthy. They paid for the best sort of tutors and encouragers to his burgeoning career. So Ruskin's encounter with Venice in particular was absolutely fundamental to his later understanding of his political theory, but also his whole idea about what humans' place was in the world. He railed against the idea of what was happening in Victorian England. The industrialization was of a great concern to him. He noticed that the industry didn't have to be ugly, and so he took as a model for much of his later political theory, he took the mercantile state of Venice. And of course, Turner illustrates that so well in his paintings, and spells in Venice. He first visited Venice when he was 14 years old, and he was struck by both the beauty of the buildings, but also he had his first real encounter with the Gothic and the Byzantine, which were to inform his understanding his understanding of architecture, which he favoured over the classical architecture, which had been so favoured by artists and art historians before this period. He also comments on a little bas relief like this one at San Michele in Florence, the hall in Florence, and the church in Florence, of the dignity of work, and this wonderful little sculpture on the side this building in Florence was a great inspiration to him, because it showed workmen, all the division of labour, that each one had a skill. They weren't part of a cog in a machine, like the picture at the top left-hand corner, that each a craftsman had a place and a part to play. And indeed, that provided great satisfaction in work. And this was to, from an early stage, this was to inform many of his ideas. That he did not want to see people become just cogs in a machine or just part of an industrial process, which he thought was so damaging to the human spirit. And this was informed by his Christianity. He felt that people were made in the image of God and therefore should be treated as such. Another great influence upon Ruskin's early life were the Romantic poets, particularly William Wordsworth, who is pictured in the middle there by our old friend Benjamin Haydon. Ruskin first encountered Wordsworth in 1839, when he was, so Ruskin was what, 20 years old at the time, and he certainly valued, he loved Wordsworth's understanding of nature, his poetry, his deep empathy with the Lakeland Fells, which were to remain a part of Ruskin's life, and indeed that is where he died eventually, in Coniston. We must remember, in the Lakeland area had been really a centre for poets like Coleridge and Wordsworth. And he also was inspired by the lines, particularly I think of the line from Endymion by John Keats, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." And that could be almost his mission statement, because Ruskin saw beauty as a gift of God, and in fact all that was beautiful should be praised. But what is beauty was the question, and how does one approach it, and how does one express it, and how does art express beauty, and what exactly it is. Ruskin also had sympathy with the poetry of Lord Byron. He was very well versed in these poets, and indeed when he was at Oxford he did in fact win a poetry prize himself, which although he didn't develop into a poet as such in his later career, one always sensed that he has a poetic inclination, and he's often making allusions to poetry throughout his work. Now, Ruskin went up to Christ Church, Oxford. His mother came up to Oxford as well. He resided in the High in Oxford. His time at Oxford University as an undergraduate was not a particularly happy one. It was coloured possibly in 1840 by his rejection by Adele Domecq in a romantic relationship, and that didn't turn out. Domecq was of course the partner of John James Ruskin in the Sherry Company, so that didn't work out, but Ruskin became ill at times whilst an undergraduate at Oxford University, and in fact he didn't actually complete his degree until quite a bit later, and he was actually said to be coughing blood in his third year at university, and it was thought he might even have consumption. I like the line from a book that I read about this period. He said that his illness necessitated a long Italian tour with his parents. I mean, when any of us get ill at university, it necessitated a long Italian tour, but that was the kind of background Ruskin came from. Of course, Ruskin was not finished with Oxford, and Oxford plays a very, very important part in Ruskin's life and his development, and he indeed becomes later on the first Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford. And of course we have the art school named after John Ruskin, and his setting up of art as an art school for workers within Oxford. So Oxford University plays an important part in John Ruskin's formation. So we come to modern painters. Now, you would be here until probably the middle of next week were I to go through each volume in detail and what it actually includes. So I'm certainly not going to do that. I'm going to give you an overview. I'm going to talk about Ruskin's great loves, and I'm also going to talk about his dislikes, because I think people, notably, he is an art critic. So therefore, what he dislikes is almost as important as what he actually likes. And for Ruskin, he was a man of very, very strong opinions. He is a man who knew his own mind. He had rational arguments. He is a man too of contradictions at times, because one sometimes cannot follow his train of thought and thinks why he would dislike this when it is so similar to something else. And we're going to see a few examples of that. Modern Painters was really begun in pamphlet form as a defense of the great Joseph Turner, the great English artist, predominantly a landscape artist. Turner was not universally acknowledged at the time. He was a great academician, but his work certainly he was the right man at the right time to explain Turner's work and what its significance was. And indeed, more and more people were wanting to find out about what was art's meaning and what was its place. So roughly, to summarize what over the next 13 years Modern Painters covers, it covers art, nature and its infinite variety. Ruskin illustrates this by various examples within Modern Painters. From volume 2, we have small plates and illustrations which he drew himself, which he was able to explain what he meant by things. The difference between typical beauty and vital beauty. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that. Sublimity, which is very important to understand Ruskin's understanding of the sublime. The picturesque, again, fundamentally important for the understanding of art of the 18th and 19th centuries. Ruskin's theories on the pathetic fallacy, and we're going to see a few examples of that today. And the use and moral value of art. Above all, to Ruskin, it wasn't sufficient to paint a pretty picture or even an accurate picture. Art had to be passionate, and art had to communicate more than just the subject before one. It had to have a moral purpose. But that doesn't mean a didactic sort of art or a moralizing, but it had to have a strong moral purpose that, as in the statement below, which I think is a great statement and sums up something of the direction of Ruskin's work, said all great art is the expression of man's delight in God's work and not his own. And this really is foundational to an understanding of John Ruskin. He constantly stresses that an artist, a creative person, has to be humble before nature and sees nature as really like a second book of God, and that God could be understood through nature. So it's very, very important. This is the background to his philosophy. It's different to many of the European philosophers who are of the Enlightenment, who do not see God as a central part of their understanding of aesthetics. So we're coming to some things that Ruskin didn't like. He's particularly critical of Dutch painting, particularly Dutch maritime painting, Van der Velde being a great example. Deep, heavy, thunderous, threatening and blue, with grey of the first coat of cheap paint on a deal door. He didn't like this. He argued with Turner, who he met, he actually formed a friendship with the older artist, Turner, commissioning certain works, but he couldn't agree with Turner that Van der Velde was worth looking at, and he found his paintings over theatrical and anti-naturalistic. And he criticised a lot of Dutch art in this way. He was very dismissive of even some pretty well-known names in Dutch art, this remained throughout his life. He did not appreciate, certainly 17th century Dutch art was not something that he particularly favoured, and indeed he would use it as examples of bad draftsmanship or the wrong understanding of light or perspective. Salvatore Rosa, he also disliked this, the love of ghastliness, he said. He did not like that type of sublime within the work. He didn't like that type of painting, and he constantly points to artists, mannerist artists, who he believed had departed from the true path of art. He was critical of Michelangelo too. Not Michelangelo himself, he liked Michelangelo's work, but he felt that imitation of Michelangelo and Raphael had led artists down the wrong road. He is particularly vicious in modern painters towards David Teniers, an example of all that is wrong. There's an example. That painting is in the Dulwich Picture Gallery, and he takes great pains to pull paintings like that apart. And he actually is one of the first critics who really stands his ground on art criticism. He shows why things are artificial, why things are not, in his view, there's a decline since the Renaissance, and he points that out in people like Teniers, Hobbema as well. John Constable, who I've just recently given a talk about, he said of Constable, he said, unteachableness seems to be the main feature of his character, and there is a corresponding want of veneration in the way he approaches nature herself. That to me seems surprising, but from what he knew of Constable's work at the time, it perhaps is because Constable's subjects he deemed as parochial. Indeed, that his landscapes were not of these great passes and valleys in the Alps like Turner's work, but they were of Suffolk waterways and seemingly not great subjects for landscape. So he didn't really temper his view of Constable, and Constable was not an artist who he thought artists should necessarily follow or emulate. This is his ideas on the picturesque, the two diagrams on here. He, like many other artists back towards Hogarth's time, were looking at ways in which there were lines of beauty within artworks. Indeed, that goes right back to the early Renaissance with Piero della Francesca. But Ruskin also is looking at these taking almost a mechanical view of taking a painting apart and looking at the underpinning lines of beauty within a work. He takes paintings like Claude's paintings to pieces in this way. He's highly critical of Claude Lorraine. He disagrees with the writer on the picturesque, William Gilpin, very much on the idea that landscape is something that should be almost arranged in a sort of capability Brown type way. He's very much against that idea. He needs nature to speak to him, and it is more important that you copy one leaf accurately than you paint a whole forest and sort of move trees over to one side to make a perfect balance within a painting. So he has passages within modern painters on windmills and on understanding of ruins within pictures, and he's very eloquent on the subject. And you are almost, if you really get into it, you're almost convinced that this is the right way to go. He talks a lot about the sublime. Now and I would rate him among some of the greatest philosophers who have written on the sublime in art, notably Immanuel Kant, Edmund Burke, of course, in the 18th century. Much of his work was to do with the sublime, and later on, more or less, just a bit before, eclipses Ruskin's time, Schopenhauer's view of the sublime. But the sublime in art covers the noble, the splendid, and the terrifying. Now, Ruskin saw great difficulty in the terrifying part of it. He moved towards the noble and the splendid, and indeed, in his drawings of the sublime himself, he thought of alpine scenery being noble and splendid, and therefore worthy of pictorial depiction. And that is why he loves so many of Turner's paintings of the alpine passes. That is why Ruskin drew so many drawings within the Alps. But he is very critical of artists who take the terrifying aspect of the sublime and without reference to nature. For instance, an artist like John Martin. who we can see in the lower bottom right-hand corner. A famous painting from the early 1850s. Martin's work was sublime, indeed it was. It's very, they were always cataclysmic things like, you know, the end of the world, or the plains of heaven, or the great flood. But Ruskin takes great task with John Martin's work, believing this is departing from a real understanding of the dynamics of nature, but a work that he really rated, and his father and he bought, was the watercolor by Turner, the song Gotthard Pass, and this is one of his favorite paintings, his favorite watercolor paintings, and that expressed to him all that was magisterial about the Alps and the action of water upon rocks and the air. Ruskin is so interested in almost every aspect of alpine scenery and the interaction of weather upon nature. And he makes these wonderful drawings in the Alps. He also illustrates what is good in the Turneresque and what is bad. And so figure 5 at the top right-hand corner gives you an idea from modern painters of his critique of earlier painters who had not observed the alpine scenery properly. And he uses Turner as a great example of how an artist has assimilated that and made something artistic from the grandeur of the alpine passes. But he is very eloquent on Claude Lorraine, and what is wrong with Claude Lorraine, the great exemplar for landscape artists, really from the 17th century onwards, people like Richard Wilson, and almost every artist had followed. If you were going to work in landscape, you would look at Claude. Indeed, Turner did himself. But what Ruskin, in a very eloquent passage in Modern Painters, he talks about Claude's landscape with dancing figures, and he shows how impossible so many of the things were in it. Indeed, how different trees grew, how they couldn't grow in that position, how he criticizes what's called the staffage within the landscape, that is the people who are in the landscape. He points out anomalies of perspective, aerial perspective, and distance within a painting. And so he's very, very critical of an artist like Claude. So this is the background to much that goes on in modern painters. It is a critique of that which has gone before, and a reassertion of that art of the now was as easily as good as the art of the former 2 centuries. And he is as good as his word. He follows Turner's work, and he praises Turner for his magisterial landscapes, particularly this one at the Pass of St. Gotthard. Also, Turner's works of Venice in the 1830s, he having visited, they accorded with his view of Venice as it is now and its beauty. And these works, these Venetian works by Turner, are some of the ones that he cites as some of the best paintings that he knew of. He got under the skin of Turner in many ways. He said the Alps brought him always sadness, but Venice delight. And it's true, to the Grand Tour, you went through these great alpine passes to come to this sunlit world of the lagoon and of a charmed place, and as Venice is and was. And certainly to the Grand Tourist it was, and it's the world of Lord Byron, of course. But for Ruskin, Venice represented so much more, and the paintings by Turner in Venice were to inform his whole career as a writer, really. In 1844, Ruskin purchased this highly important work by Turner, The Slave Ship. It depicts the slaves being thrown overboard in a squall in the ocean. It's a harrowing painting of the sea, all the elements churning up, the dominant light, the activity upon the canvas is a profound cry of help. We have fish, we have the chains of the shackles of the slaves being smashed in the waves. This, must remember, is nearly 40 years after the slavery had been abolished, but its long legacy is depicted in paintings, and there's never been a better painting to describe this awful scene of the slaves being thrown overboard. Ruskin has a very eloquent passage in Modern Painters upon this particular painting, which he was happy to purchase, and which is so profoundly human in many ways, and yet it has aspects of it which reach out far beyond the confines of the canvas. And the great Mark Twain in America, I like this little passage from A Tramp Abroad because it really, really points out the effect that Ruskin is having internationally, or did have internationally, on so many people. As we'll see at the end of this talk, he has had an effect upon very many unlikely people, but they responded to his prose and his passion about painting. Mr. Ruskin is educated up to a point where that picture throws him into a mad ecstasy of pleasure, as it used to throw me into one of rage last year when I was ignorant. His cultivation enables him and me now to see water that is glaring yellow mud and natural effects of those lurid explosions of mixed smoke and flame and crimson sunset glories. It reconciles him and me now to the floating of the or iron cable chains and the other unfloatable things. It reconciles us to the fishes swimming around on the top of the mud, I mean water. The most of the picture is a manifest impossibility, that is to say, a lie, and only rigid cultivation can enable a man to find truth in a lie. But it enabled Mr. Ruskin to do it, and it has enabled me to do it, and I am thankful for it. A Boston newspaper reporter went and to take a look at the slave ship, floundering about in fierce configuration of reds and yellows, and said it reminded him of a tortoiseshell cat having a fit in a platter of tomatoes. In my then uneducated state, that went home to my non-cultivation, and I thought, here is a man with unobstructive eye. Mr. Ruskin would have said, that person is an ass. That is what I would say now. And Twain picks up on the point that so many, once they're grasped by Ruskin, are persuaded by him and persuaded by his arguments. Ruskin, it was very unpopular to be an advocate for such abstract paintings as this in 1844. And yet these paintings have proved and stood the test of time. Ruskin really had, there are two quotes there, but Ruskin had more to do with establishing Turner in our national pantheon of artists than anybody else. And it is questionable whether Turner would have occupied the place he now enjoys had it not been for John Ruskin. However, by 1846, their friendship went through a rocky patch. Turner died in 1851, and Ruskin was able to. One thing about Ruskin is he could be dead honest with you. He would say his opinion. He wasn't afraid of his opinion. Indeed, he would always back it up. And he suggested to Turner that his angel standing in the sun was indicative of mental disease. Indeed, Turner was quite eccentric. By every varnishing day of the 1840s, he was a witness retouching his paintings, or indeed even was repainting his paintings. Ruskin, on Turner's death, was charged with cataloguing Turner's vast catalogue of paintings, many thousands, over 20,000 watercolours and drawings. Ruskin came across bundles of erotic drawings. Now, it was originally said that he destroyed most of these, but that has proved to be false. There were some erotic drawings that I believe he did destroy, but some still survive. But they disquieted Ruskin about Turner's character, and I think after after Turner's death, when he saw so much more of Ruskin, of Turner's work, there was a slight falling off with his admiration of Turner and a longing for a new group of artists who would take up the baton and this truth to nature. So this is part of his cry within the book Modern Painters. It's using Turner almost as giving birth to a new school, he hoped, probably in a Turneresque vein, but that wasn't to be the case, actually. He talks in Modern Painters about two types of beauty, and these are expounded over many pages, and I haven't got time to go into all the different examples, but I'll give you two examples. One was what he called vital beauty, and an example of that is Edwin Landseer's painting, The Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner. We talked about Landseer before and his paintings of animals, and he sees in vital beauty, that is a living beauty, that is flourishing like a tree. He sees in typical beauty, as in this painting of the death of the poet Chatterton, painted by Henry Wallace, he sees there a repose and a classic thing which looks back to the great tombs that he painted in various churches. And so there are two types, there's a tension between the two types of beauty, which he goes on to explain within Modern Painters, and how artists should aspire to one or other of these types within their work. And he particularly is fond of that within, particularly with vital beauty, the way trees and plants grow. And this is throughout his life, he is constantly looking at those particular factors within painting. It was in 1850, 49 and 50 that the Pre-Raphaelites had come on the scene and had gained Ruskin's eye, but he had not commented upon them in those years of controversy, those early years of controversy. We can remember how Charles Dickens tore into the painting Christ in the House of His Parents. So we discussed this before in this group. And he had, the Pre-Raphaelites were criticised for being vulgar, for demeaning religious subjects, for painting things in their hyper attention to detail and reality. But the man who had much inspired that was William Holman Hunt, who had gone to the early volumes of Modern Painters and had taken up Ruskin's dictum of going to nature with a singleness of heart and selecting nothing and rejecting nothing, and to let nature teach you and to just bring that about. And Ruskin, in his letter from Denmark Hill, where they've moved by then in August 1851, he comes to the defense of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. And in that preface there, we can see it's reprinted up there. He comes to the defense. It's like a knight coming in on a charger and a horse. And we know after that point, the call had been answered, and Ruskin, the great critic of art, had come on the side of these young men, these young rebels, the Pre-Raphaelites. And he saw among them, particularly in the paintings of John Everett Millais, an artist who he hoped to fashion towards his way of seeing the world. He already noticed that in his work, not necessarily in his subject matter, but in the way he approached nature. Look at the painting of the straw on the floor of the Ark. He also liked the details in Charles Collins' painting A Convent Thoughts, and he loved the humility before nature, to paint nature in this way. And so he met with the Pre-Raphaelites, who were being parodied in Punch. As you can see, there are two cartoons there of the time parodying Millais' painting Mariana and the one of Convent Thoughts by Collins. And we talked about that in the Oxford talk. But a painting, above all, that exemplifies a Ruskin's dictum: go to nature in all singleness of heart, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, believing all things to be right and good, and rejoicing always in the truth. So Millais, when he painted this painting of Ophelia, he painted every touch from nature, doing it exactly what Ruskin had longed that artists would do. So very different to Turner, who internalized it. He memorized nature and then painted it back in the studio. Millais worked outside of the studio, but on the riverbank, and never had a painting ever before put an English country stream under such scrutiny as did John Everett Millais. And Ruskin was captivated by this work in the fact he could identify every single flower within the painting. He was captivated by the technique and the outstanding technical abilities of this young artist, John Everett Millais. So much so that his wife, his young wife, Effie Ruskin, sat for the Order of Release painting, 1852 to 53. Now, Ruskin had married in 1848 to Effie Gray, a young woman from a well-to-do family, the Gray family in Perth. And this was after the disappointment with Adele Domecq. Ruskin, it really was, the families knew one another. There was some talk that he might not marry Effie because Effie's father had been involved in a bad investment in railways, and that had gone a bit wrong. But by the time they married in 1848, the financial situation had stabilised. It should be mentioned that Ruskin had actually written a little fairy tale, The King of the Golden River, in 1842, which he had given to the child Effie Gray. So they knew each other from childhood, and this isn't unusual. But that was the book, The King of the Golden River, and that's the cover of it, written by John Ruskin. So in late 1852, early 1853, Ruskin suggested to Millet that he would like a portrait. His father, John James Ruskin, wanted a portrait to hang in Denmark Hill of his son, and according to Ruskinian principles, would Millet paint his portrait. And this was an enormous turning point in Ruskin's life, Millet's life, and indeed the whole of Victorian England's life in many ways. So they went up to a place called Brigger Turk, about maybe 10 miles from Callander in Perthshire, in the Trossachs. And I've been to this place. It's a wonderful little waterfall, a little stream called Glen Finglas, which tumbles over these gneiss rocks, very important. Ruskin is a great geologist, and so he studied this rock, and this rock was very important to him. I can show you, there is my photograph of the actual waterfall that Ruskin stood upon. And I first visited there in 1978. And I've been back a few times since then and actually stood on the rock which Ruskin stood on. I've taken a detail from our painting in the Ashmolean Museum of the Rock, and I've superimposed there Millet's foxglove portrait, because as Millet painted painstakingly from the rocks at the side of Glen Finglas, remember he'd leave just a space for the Ruskin portrait, and as Effie stitched away on her garments, young Effie Millet, young Effie Ruskin and young John Everett Millet fell in love. It became apparent to Millet that there was a peculiar relationship between Ruskin and Effie, a distance, a social distance, a kind of a coldness almost, and Millet was becoming quite upset by the fact that Ruskin was in a way ignoring his wife, and obviously Millet was beginning to fall in love with Effie, and she was responding to him. What we know, of course, what came out in the story was, and has been dramatised in the film Effie Gray, but in many, many books, Lutchin's book, that the marriage has in fact been unconsummated. And it was 6 years into their marriage, and yet Ruskin had not consummated the marriage, and there was a distance between the couple. For whatever reason, there are many theories about why the marriage was unconsummated. Did Ruskin imagine that women, when undressed, looked like a Greek sculpture? I don't think so. I don't think that is the explanation. But for whatever reason, the marriage was not consummated, and there was a great distance between the two. And Effie was a vivacious young woman, and Millet draws these little cartoons at the time, sheltering with Effie under his cloak in a Highland shower, and it was quite clear that the relationship between Ruskin and Effie had come to a crisis point, precipitated by this painting. And it wasn't long before she was to leave John Ruskin, and the marriage was in fact annulled. It wasn't wasn't divorced. It was annulled because of non-consummation of the marriage, and so it was as if it hadn't happened. It would be the following year, 1855, that John Everett Millet would marry Effie Gray in Perth, just like she had married Ruskin, but a much more successful union, and one that many, many children came from. And but Ruskin was not bitter about it. This is a peculiar thing about it. We can read the letters at this period. I'd like to also point out that they seemed, whilst in the schoolhouse at Brigger Turk, seemed to be getting on okay, certainly on an artistic level, and they designed these wonderful things together. In fact, Effie painted some of the watercolour background to this window design, designed by John Ruskin and John Everett Millais. Millais designed this wonderful Gothic window in 1853, which is now in Sidmonton House in Hampshire. Andrew Lloyd Webber had that actually carved in stone, and it's in a house in Hampshire. So that's 140 years later he had it carved, and a wonderful example of Ruskin tutoring Millais in the Gothic. And Ruskin also designed, at this point, windows, which were to eventually become part of the windows at the great Oxford University Museum of Natural History, whilst on this particular stay in the Trossachs. The painting was finished, of course, but it's well documented, but a very, very peculiar situation had arisen, and Ruskin went back to Switzerland. And Millais and Effie went up to stay at the family home at Balswell in Perth, whilst the scandal sort of hit London. And it sees a difference in direction in Millais' art from this part on. But Ruskin was working on his great work at this time, concurrently with modern painters. He was working on his great work, The Stones of Venice. And architecture is the art which so disposes and adorns the edifices raised by man that the sight of them may contribute to his mental health, power and pleasure. A profound statement, and something that is intrinsic to Ruskin's work. The whole idea that the nobility of work and using nature to enhance people's mental health and mental states. And these words ring true today. These are some capitals at Southwell Minster. Painted these wonderful. Ruskin was not just a critic, he could dish it out, certainly, but he could also paint beautifully. And this is an example where he can even give Turner a run for his money in a beautiful monochrome watercolour for the Stones of Venice. And yes, he suggested that architects should study nature. It wasn't just about mathematics and engineering, it was about a feeling for nature. And by observing nature, you could really gain a much better understanding of architecture, and vice versa. And he saw that in the Gothic. He saw the Gothic expression as this perfect marriage between nature and art and architecture. And that is why he always favoured the Gothic over the classical. Now, you might imagine for a man whose marriage had broken down that he would be bitter, but none of it. On seeing John Everett Millais' contribution to the Royal Academy of 1855, he goes into an ecstasy about this painting, and indeed it includes two of Effie's sisters in this painting, the first instance of perfectly painted twilight. Ruskin by now was championing all forms of pre-Raphaelitism, but he believed this painting to be the most perfect example of twilight painting since the time of Giorgione. Whether that is a little bit of hyperbole, I don't know, but I would say this is Millais' finest painting, and a very profound work it is too. It is all about transience, of loss, of the fleeting nature of childhood and moving into adulthood. It also communicates many of a Tennyson type sentiment about tears, idle tears, I know not what they mean. And Ruskin said of a dead leaf, he said, if you can paint one leaf, you can paint the whole world. And this is part, so it exposed Ruskin's actual theory about painting from nature and what it could do, and how it could be elegiac and poetic. And this was really, really important to John Ruskin. But the painting 2 years later was a complete disaster, according to Ruskin. He said, not merely a fall, it is a catastrophe. John Everett Millais' Ceres and Brass, A Dream of the Past, 1857, and parodied by the up-and-coming artist Frederick Sands, and he did this parody etching called A Nightmare. And if you notice on the rump of the donkey, J.R. Oxon is written on the back. So they're sort of making fun of Ruskin in this one, that Millet, Rossetti and Hunt are being led across by a donkey across a river, and the pre-Raphaelite movement has fallen apart, with Hunt going to the Holy Land, Rossetti moving into a world that is of medievalism and away from society, polite society, that is. So this is a lovely parody in a way on a painting which I don't think is as bad as Ruskin said, but certainly isn't Millet's greatest painting. But under his wing, Ruskin was able to pay and patronize various artists at the time and commission work. And so he really takes to this artist, John Brett, a Welsh artist, who goes to Switzerland and follows Ruskinian principles. And here is his wonderful one of the glacier. It's similar to the drawing that Ruskin himself made at Glenfinlas. So it depicts every little strata and every rock, and that follows Ruskinian principles to the nth degree, really. And Brett is an artist who is of this new school of pre-Raphaelite landscape artists, and he continues to paint in this myopic style. And if you notice in the background, he does sort of blend something of the sort of Turner-esque into it as well. But very different. Brett also followed Ruskinian principles in this one of the Stonebreaker, which is his comment upon the most menial form of work, really, that there was going. And Ruskin was beginning in these stages to talk about the dignity of labour and indeed the inhumanity of capitalism. And this was a big part of Ruskin's work, and he coincided with the teachings of Thomas Carlyle, who is depicted in Ford Madox Brown's famous painting work of 1852 to 65. And so this is another great theme that is coming out in Ruskinian landscapes. And this painting by Brett is an excellent example, painted in Box Hill in Surrey on the North Downs. Very, very accurate painting, again in detail that Millet was now leaving behind. Brett was slipped into his shoes and painted like this. But it wasn't all of Brett's paintings which were successful. Ruskin criticised this one, painted in his beloved Switzerland, as too much like a photograph lacking in grandeur and artistic expression. So Ruskin always felt painting had to be something more than mere mimicry. It had to come under the skin of the landscape, rather like Turner's paintings did. So, but a painting he did praise was this In Early Spring by John William Inchbold, and this one is in the Ashmolean Museum, and he had said this one was exceedingly beautiful, which indeed it is, and it exemplifies all of Ruskin's thoughts about nature and things that he exposited in modern painters. At this time, we're moving into a time of great difficulty for Ruskin. Ruskin is a man who investigates absolutely everything. He has to take it to its conclusion, and particularly he has his crisis of faith begins at a time which is essentially a very shaking time for all of Victorian England and men of letters and the church, because with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, and also discoveries made by geologists, the age of the Earth was being certainly questioned, and certainly the evangelical side of Ruskin was becoming deeply disturbed by the discoveries. He met William Buckland when he was at Oxford. Buckland had made many discoveries as well of dinosaur bones near Cumnor, near Oxford. Ruskin says to his great friend, Dr. Henry Ackland, you speak of the flimsiness of your own faith. Mine, which was never strong, is being beaten into a mere gold leaf, and it flutters in weak rags from the letter of its old forms. But the only letters it can hold are the old evangelical formulae. If only the geologists would let me alone, I could do very well. But those dreadful hammers, I hear the clink of them at the end of every cadence of the Bible verses. And there's the hammers beating away. And that's the painting which I've talked about before, Pegwell Bay by William Dyce, which is of some women on the shore uncovering fossils on the beach and bringing about this great question that was to arise in a Victorian mind. and come to this point in the great debate in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, which Ruskin had been such a part of with Ackland in setting up, and it had brought about this doubt. Expressed also in paintings of the time, Alexander Bowler's painting, Can These Dry Bones Live? There we're looking at scientific explanations of things, and a curiosity about what happens on death, and what is the Bible absolutely literally true in the sense that Ruskin originally understood it to be so. And of course, we have this great debate that takes place with these well-reported, but maybe not. There wasn't absolute accurate transcript of it, but maybe this is near to it. But Soapy Sam, or Bishop Wilberforce, he himself a mathematician, and he was a wonderful orator, a wonderful speaker. Was Bishop Wilberforce, of course, the son of William Wilberforce, but he comes up with this: is it on your grandmother's or grandfather's side that you are descended from an ape? And Huxley answers him, a man has no reason to be ashamed of having an ape for his grandfather. And whilst Darwin himself wasn't prepared to argue the case in the museum, Huxley certainly was. And so this is the great chasm that is opening up. And for Ruskin, it did, during the early 1860s, mean quite a shaking and even a loss of his early evangelical faith. But Ruskin was involved very much in the Great Museum, stemming out of some of his ideas in modern painters, and the Stones of Venice was our Great Museum here in Oxford. And he employed the James O'Shea, who was the mason, and Benjamin Woodward, the architect from Ireland. And O'Shea brothers were paid £2 for each capital that they carved, so they weren't paid very well. But the museum shows Ruskinian principles in its use of different stones, and each capital was carved with different types of leaves and birds, and is a work of art itself. But it is a cathedral to science, and Ruskin is a man who embraces all these things really since the Renaissance. We've had a few polymaths, but Ruskin certainly is a polymath, and quite able to step in the world of science and literature and art, and quite confident in all areas. And so the Great Museum is a great testament to his input. Ruskin also was encouraging other artists at the time. You might think it's strange that he would encourage such a bohemian as Dante Gabriel Rossetti, but he recognized in Rossetti some of the things that he had talked about in Modern Painters 3, and that was about the grotesque. So in fact, Rossetti's work, which was always much more imaginative and not based on a direct observation of nature, but had the spirit of medievalism about it. He recognized a great artist in Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and he counted Rossetti as a great friend, whereas the contact with Millet had been completely broken off. Not, I may say so, from Ruskin had wanted to keep friends with Millet, but Millet would have none of it, and particularly, of course, Effie would have none of that. They needed a complete break from John Ruskin and his cruelty, as she would have said it. But Ruskin became very friendly with Rossetti. He was not comfortable around Bohemia at all, was Ruskin. Of course, he came from a different class and different kind of background, so he found it hard to understand Rossetti's ways with women, particularly Elizabeth Siddal, who was the model for Ophelia, who was now Rossetti's lover, she was becoming addicted to laudanum, which we can see some bottles of in the corner there, so there were complexities to his relationship with Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But he did commission many lovely watercolors by Rossetti, and then also the work in here, which we talked about in former talk about the work in the Oxford Union Library, and the employment of these artists, and in painting murals on the walls of the Arthurian legend as recited by Tennyson. And we notice some of the names that I've talked about before come in on the scene now and under Ruskin's sway, particularly Burne-Jones, Valentine Prinsep, Arthur Hughes, who already a sort of disciple of Millet, Spencer Stanhope, and the young William Morris. William Morris, who had trained in architecture, Edward Burne-Jones in divinity, but both had been great friends at Exeter College and remained friends throughout their life. And both men, in various ways, were linked with Ruskin for the rest of their lives. And Burne-Jones very much fell under, well, Ruskin took Burne-Jones, who was not initially trained in art at all. So Ruskin took a sort of proprietorial angle on Burne-Jones, but he was a quick learner. Burne-Jones liked the work of Michelangelo, which Ruskin, as I've already explained, did not advise painters to follow Michelangelo. He felt that led people into all kinds of manneristic mistakes. Rather, he introduced him to Andrea Mantegna, and Mantegna was in fact to inform so much of Burne-Jones's art. And there we go, can see that one wonderful painting from the Pygmalion series. And I found this lovely little cartoon which rather illustrates the awkwardness of Ruskin among Bohemia. There is Ruskin meeting Fanny Cornforth and with Rossetti, a rather portly Rossetti and a portly Fanny Cornforth, probably in the 1880s or just before Rossetti died. But this awkwardness that he had with the world of Bohemia, and yet as a great art critic, he involved himself in it, but not to the extent that he ever accepted Algernon Swinburne's invitations to go to Whistler's studio and various other such things. Although Ruskin took a great interest in all that was going on, but of course this led to many things that went on later. Another artist who didn't really want to fall under his sway was William Bell-Scott, a slightly older man than Ruskin himself. Again, somebody who produced paintings that ostensibly looked like Ruskinian principal paintings, and yet Ruskin and Bell-Scott apparently didn't get on, although he knew him through Rossetti. But Lady Trevelyan, who was a confidant of John Ruskin during the difficulties with his marriage to Effie, after the break, he had corresponded quite a bit with Lady Trevelyan, commissioned paintings for Bell-Scott at Wallington Hall in Northumberland, and they're some of the finest Bell-Scott paintings there, and some of them exemplify work, the dignity of work, also about hard manual work, and Wallington Hall, although not built in the Gothic style, does have a number of pre-Raphaelite inspired paintings. And Bell-Scott did paint a few paintings that probably Ruskin would not turn his nose up at. Ruskin was very, very keen on encouraging working men's art and classes. And so in 1871, he started up his drawing school in Oxford. And there we can see the easels. He had commissioned many, many artists to paint copies of work in Venice and in Florence for working class artists to copy and to set up evening classes and classes that would give people something much more dignity in labour. And so we have all of these drawing examples in the Ashmolean Museum, and they're just boxes of these things, of example watercolours. And Ruskin, as we know, became the first Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford University. But he taught using his own examples or examples from some of the artists that he'd liked. And so that's a little photograph from inside his drawing school in 1871. Now, there's a great difference between Morris and Ruskin. Both had a great passion for the working man, for seeing the ill effects of industrial England being addressed. For Morris, it came to a crisis point, and he declared himself a socialist, and his Commonweal pamphlets led to what eventually became the foundation of the Labour Party and a Labour movement within Britain. But for Ruskin, he was always what was known as a high Tory. And he says, "I am, and my father was before me, a violent Tory of the old school." But we shouldn't think of his being a Tory as somehow allied with the bosses of industry. Far from it. He would upbraid people in Sheffield and Manchester. He would travel across the country to argue for better working conditions and for greater dignity within work, and indeed noble occupation for people who in their downtime, that they would do things that were good, and they would have the access to art and to beauty. So there was a division between Morris and Ruskin in many ways, although both worked towards the greater good of particularly young men in society and gainful employment. We will probably be looking at William Morris at some later talk. I hope you will. And that's a page from the Kelmscott Press, carved by Morris from the Stones of Venice. And look how beautifully Morris carved the plate for that. By the late 1870s, Ruskin wasn't, there were people beginning to stand up to him and criticising, most notably James McNeill Whistler, as we'll see in a minute. Ruskin, there are parodies of him. There's one there of a Mr. Narcissus Ruskin, based on the Caravaggio Narcissus. In 1871, he sets up the Guild of St. George, and just in my village, Ruskin encouraged the people just down the road from me at Hinksey. He encouraged undergraduates to do some manual work by road building and draining the marshy ground behind our houses here. And they were called the Diggers of North Hinksey, and among them was Oscar Wilde and Arnold Toynbee. And there's a lovely little poem in Punch at the time. It says, "Scholars of Ruskin, to him be true. The truths he has written in the Stones of Venice may be taught by the Stones of Hinksey too." I think they are. So it was the working men of Hinksey rather laughed at these rather posh undergraduates trying to dig trenches and dig roads and things like that. There's still a plaque up down the road on one of the houses to John Ruskin's work there. And he practiced what he preached, did Ruskin. I don't know whether he actually picked up a shovel himself, but he certainly his undergraduates did. And then came the trial, which I talked about before, in 1878, the great arts for art's sake versus the great John Ruskin. John Ruskin was taken to court by the American artist James McNeill Whistler about this painting. Ruskin had declared that it had flung a pot of paint in the public's face, and there was a court case, as we know. McNeill Whistler's great cry was that art should be independent of all claptrap, should stand alone and appeal to artistic sense of the eye or ear. So hence his paintings were called nocturnes or arrangements. And so this great trial takes place, but Ruskin's health his mental health is very, very poor by this stage, and he wasn't able to stand in the dock at the court. And so John Holker QC is advocate for him, and various artists are brought in defence, including Burne-Jones, who gives rather a lukewarm defence of Ruskin in one sense. Certainly isn't strong enough. He knew Whistler as well. He could see merits in Whistler's painting as a sketch, maybe not a finished work, but it did change the whole scene in British art really at the time. And really things were never the same again after the Whistler trial, at which of course Ruskin lost and had to pay a farthing damages. But it was a victory for Whistler in many ways, and Ruskin's star was falling after this particular point in time. Also, the complications with a very odd relationship with Rose Latouche. Latouche family from Ireland, a very again, quite a well-to-do family, quite a religious family, and John Ruskin had befriended the young Rose Latouche from the age of 11 years old. It was a friendship, and I don't think there was anything sinister about it in the early stages at all, but by the time she was 18, he did propose marriage to Rose Latouche, but it was a complicated relationship. It's believed that Rose Latouche also suffered from mental health problems, probably anorexia nervosa. Also, she was chaperoned, of course, which is only the right Victorian etiquette at the time, but her parents having learnt more about Ruskin's failed marriage to Effie, discouraged any kind of relationship between that and a man of 20 years her senior, particularly one who had not consummated his marriage, because above all, they would have wanted grandchildren. And so Rose Latouche has something, actually is a very intelligent woman and writes some wonderful letters, even from her girlhood. She's a very devout Christian, but it veers into a sort of religious mania. Ruskin too's faith had returned somewhat by the 1870s, and he corresponded to her about all sorts of matters, and he was able to correspond with her bit by bit, but it was not helping his mental health. It was a relationship conducted basically by letters, very few meetings, and the meetings that were unsatisfactory and caused Ruskin a great deal of discomfort, and no doubt Rose Latouche and her family discomfort. And he became delirious at various points, and he associated her with the painting by Carpaccio, The Dream of St. Ursula, and he almost saw he almost had hallucinations about Rose Latouche, and we know that there are many periods of insanity where he even believes Rose Latouche is speaking to him, even although she died. And this is a curious period. Tim Hilton talks about it a lot in his book. We must refrain from putting a modern day interpretation upon it about things we just cannot know. But what we do know is that Ruskin's mental health was not in a good state by the late 1870s. And as he was beginning to write his never finished autobiography, he said, "Some wise and prettily mannered people have told me I shouldn't say anything about Rosie at all," but he did. And Rose Latouche writes, "I wish so very much that you were happy. God can make you so. We will try not to forget all that you taught us. It was so nice of you." So there was this very awkward period in Ruskin's life of great mental delirium. He resigns his Slade professorship. He resumes it a bit later when he gets back to full health again, or certainly able to teach again. But things were never quite the same after this particular period. And so in 1871, on the death of his mother, he buys Brantwood, the great property up in the Lake District on Coniston Water. And there he really effectively works from Brantwood. During the 1870s and early 1880s, he's still very active in writing. He continues to write his academy notes on the paintings each year. He he's surrounded by his Turner watercolors. That's in his bedroom at Brantwood, and there he is writing in his study overlooking Lake Coniston. He had the turret on the side of the building built so he could view the whole of Coniston Water, and if you've been there, you know it's a marvellous place. He also was able to row his cousin Joan Severn out on Coniston Water, and there's Ruskin, a very late photograph of Ruskin rowing his cousin Joan Severn on in his boat Jumping Jenny on Coniston Water. And it's curious, isn't it? The very late John Ruskin, who was a great champion of Turner and Millet, of Tintoretto, Veronese, all the greats of art, descends into really defending what I would say artists of a very much a second-rate nature. It's possibly because he didn't really have the sway that he once did. So he supports the work of Helen Allingham. Sweet enough watercolours as they are, then they're hardly Turneresque. Miles Burkitt Foster, lovely watercolours, but really not up to Samuel Prout or a Turner watercolour, and Kate Greenaway, very, very sweet little illustrations, and even his Arthur Severn's watercolours, which he had. Arthur Severn, who actually was quite friendly with Whistler, so he was in an awkward position with Ruskin most of his life, but he lived at Brantwood with Ruskin and, of course, Joan, says this about Ruskin, and this is something that we might want to listen to. Ruskin had many curious characteristics, and it was by no means a bed of roses living with him. Although extremely kind and generous to a fault in some ways, he could be just the opposite. None of us dared contradict him on any subject without his flying into a passion. What he liked was absolute obedience, and in return, he would pet and flatter. the ideal was a kind of feudal system. Everyone would mould him, willing to help, to obey and to love him. All such who ventured to differ or put him right. Of course, a pretty girl could do a little if it amused him, but it was hardly any other kind of human being. And this is very true of Ruskin's character. In a way, he just disliked being contradicted. I suppose because of his supreme intelligence, he lacked sometimes magnanimity to hold back from saying things to people. And indeed, the last 10 years of his life was almost silent. There's very little. He was visited by Henry Ackland, his friend from Oxford, but we believe he retreated into a vast depression. He was also obsessed with the idea of the storm cloud of the 19th century, which he had noticed from 1884 onwards, both a metaphoric storm cloud, but also one of pollution. And his ideas about the environment developed at his time at Brantwood. And he was very, very concerned about the planet and the possible bad effects of carbon-based pollution on the atmosphere. And he had observed changes in the atmosphere above the Lake District. Ruskin died in 1900 on the 20th of January, and is buried in Coniston Courtyard, churchyard. And the cross was designed by his protege, W.G. Collingwood, and you can go to his grave to this very day. These are the fells around his home that he so loved. An extraordinary character who speaks to us today through his work. Here's just a few things that he talks about, which he's almost prophetic in his work. He influenced the young Mahatma Gandhi. He influenced the prose of Marcel Proust, who translated Ruskin's work. He predicted things like natural disasters, and he predicted things like industrial accidents and disasters, like the Chernobyl disaster. Not exactly nuclear power, he didn't know anything about that, but he predicted that that such things would happen and could even threaten the very future of mankind. And these things are commented upon in the storm cloud of the 19th century. His views upon nature are very similar to our own David Attenborough's, and very, very closely allied with such views on man's place in nature, and not abusing man's unique place was one that he saw as God-given, to make sure that we didn't abuse our place within nature. But he was beginning to become thoroughly depressed about how humans were acting, both in their social economy, but also towards the world and animals and to nature itself. And his ideas were very much influential upon John Muir of the Sierra Club in the USA, and I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about American art in a few weeks' time. Dream lofty dreams, and as you dream, so shall you become. John Ruskin.